Hello, and thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to be having a panel discussion with CISOs and cybersecurity experts throughout the market. And what we are going to talk about is kind of the new SEC rules for publicly traded companies. And we're going to talk about some of the definitions and what that means to publicly traded companies. And then also the ever-growing importance of having the CISO voice heard on a public board of directors. Obviously, a lot of CISOs report directly to boards quarterly, but nowadays, more and more common that CISOs are literally sitting on the board at a publicly traded company. So today we're going to dive into all of those fun issues. And real quickly, we'll just go around and everyone introduce who you are, our names and titles, what company we're at, and we'll keep that short and then dive right into our topic. So Jim, if you can, just kind of tell us who you are.
Jim Ralph, and I'm a former six-time CISO, mostly financial service companies and healthcare companies. I served on the FS-ISAC board and the Health ISAC board for many years. And I'm currently a board member, advisor, investor, and I teach cybersecurity at the NYU Tannen School of Engineering.
Outstanding. Thanks for joining us today, Jim. And Sue, what about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Sue Bergamo. A lot like Jim, former CISO, CIO, and now giving executive advice to teams and board members, doing some training and trying to get companies to understand that security is important no matter at what level you are in the organization.
Outstanding. Dee.
Hello, I'm Didi Buriharto. Similarly, I'm a former CISO for oil and gas companies in Houston, Texas. I currently serve as a fractional CISO and advisory board members for several universities.
Outstanding. Thank you. Erica?
Hello, Erica Wilson. I'm a former CISO. Most of my experience is in the financial services industry. I currently work in reinsurance, and my formal title is Vice President of Cybersecurity and Privacy Risk Management.
Outstanding. Andrew?
Hey, Andrew Wilder. I'm also a former CISO. Do some board work, nonprofit boards, advisory boards. I'm also an adjunct professor at Washington University.
In St. Louis. Awesome. Thanks for joining us today, Andrew, and helping put this thing together. Matt, how about yourself?
Yeah, Matt Modica. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at BJC Healthcare here in St. Louis. BJC is a large provider health system in Missouri and Illinois. About 32,000 employees, about 4,000 inpatient beds, just to put it in scale and scope.
Absolutely. And Mark Ashworth?
I'm Mark Ashworth. I'm the CISO for First Bank out of St. Louis. We're one of the largest privately held banks, family owned in the nation. And we're located in about 5 states.
I love it. I love that we have some folks that have all of the healthcare data privacy. We've got financial service companies. We've got some different industries being represented, which is outstanding. Bob, what about your background?
Yep, Bob Sheeter, CISO for Ashland, a kind of a legacy chemical company, the specialty materials and ingredients manufacturer.
Outstanding. And Maureen?
Hi, I'm Maureen Allison. I'm a recovering CISO from Johnson & Johnson, just out 6 months. I'm doing board of directors work, cybersecurity advisory, as well as working with some venture capital on some first and second phase good technologies out there.
Outstanding. Some of you guys know each other already, some may not. You guys will all be tagged as we roll this out live and, hopefully encourage you guys to stay in touch with each other. So thank you guys for joining me today. Let's just first start with, on July the 25th, the SEC adopted some final rules regarding cybersecurity risk management and governance and incident reporting within public companies. And they require those companies to report material cybersecurity incidents within 4 days. And so maybe there's some new rules that could be facing publicly traded companies. Let's talk about what does that mean for them? What are the implications? And do companies all understand what the definitions even are of this at this point? Let me kind of start, if I can, with Matt.
Sure. Yeah. So, I guess the first question that I'm thinking of is around, definition of materiality, right? And I think that's kind of where you were going or where you're talking about there. So, I think in the SEC rule, they make it pretty clear, what, how they define materiality. And it's really just that, the same definition that they use for any kind of materiality around investor, stakeholder engagement ultimately, right? So, and more specifically, it says information is material if there's a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important in making an investment decision, or if it would have significantly altered the total mix of information made available, right? So I think they've made it relatively clear. I think the art, though, in it is really around how does each organization define material to their specific set of services, their specific set of products. And so I think, that's the devil's in the details there ultimately around that and how we should measure that.
Does anyone on the call have some interesting stories internally about where you've been or boards you've sat on around this issue, or around how you guys have defined the material cybersecurity incident?
Well, I'll share with this. I work for a number of public companies. We've been defining materiality in cybersecurity for decades. So it's not a new concept in a public company. It's actually pretty basic. What's fundamentally different here is this is materiality in terms of notification to a regulator. And all of us deal with counsel, general counsel, or head of legal, or head of compliance, or there's essentially consensus on what is materiality for an incident from a reporting standpoint. It becomes a little bit murkier when we recognize, in terms of precedent, who do we think gets censured or gets blamed for a lack of reporting? Would it be the compliance officer, or would it be the CISO? The answer is unfortunately, very obvious. It's the CISO. So, in fact, in reporting to regulators, typically legal has a pretty strong stake in whether that reporting takes place or not. In fact, a CISO would have a bit of a struggle to try to convince the head of legal that we need to report an incident. It's possible, it's practical, it's been done, but it's a bit of a challenge. Now, the irony is that with that imbalance, if you will, in the consensus process for reporting, the CISO is really the one accountable. So the CISO has more skin in the game, just in terms of precedent and enforcement. So it makes this challenge of defining materiality a little bit greater. The last point is that I suspect most of us have cybersecurity incident response processes that are well defined, and then we have critical or crisis management practices that are pretty well established. Very often, cybersecurity incidents that make it to a crisis management escalation do so based on a definition of materiality, and usually there's some metrics. I know I use some very specific metrics in terms of number of victims, and basically it was all in the interest of shareholder impact. So once again, materiality in the definition, I don't necessarily think is what's really the struggle, because we've been doing that for a long time in the public enterprises. But I think what is a struggle is getting the consensus on reporting to a regulator with a chief legal officer, and then reconciling the CISO responsibility and accountability for doing so.
And I'd add into that. I came from the defense industrial base before the chemical industry, and we've been required to notify the government on a number of different pieces within the defense industrial base as it pertains to national security. And what's interesting, I think a lot of people will find, back to your point, Jim, is the notification process became a process unto itself where we had, basically a discussion between a council or committee of members, right? Whether it was regulatory, whether it was legal, had a lot of the say into it. Does this really truly, cross over that threshold? And I think our concern from a private sector perspective is we're getting to this area where a number of people want this information, right? It's not just going to one and notifying that one entity. It's a number of different entities on a number of different timelines. I think that's becoming more and more complex, which is why I think a lot of this is going to become this committee-based piece. But to Jim's point, the ownership of that is not necessarily committee-based.
Yeah, and Jeremy, one of the things is John Warner, a number of years ago, the SEC has been requiring us to report on materiality for years. And one of the very first things that I think most CISOs did was you have to create the escalation and how you're going to do that. Especially some of us in healthcare, we've known with HIPAA and having a data breach response team and all of those things, it's just the upping the game to the 4 days, which once you determine materiality. Now, as we all know, something that goes bump in the night today, it might be 6 months before we go, oh, look at that. That's much larger than a bread box. And is this material to bring it to someone? And what will be that question is kind of what have we done in that meantime to look at that? And then, of course, I love the SEC came out one day and said 4 days, and the FBI came out about a week later and said, no, please don't do that unless, because of its national security or a criminal act. And which I just said, okay, again, the CISO has to act reasonably and have good, keeping book of what their process is in the minutes of their meetings so that they know and can present evidence that they've done what they were supposed to do and escalate up their chain of command that it's occurring.
Right.
I'd like a little different tact on this if I can.
Yes.
So I actually like the 4-day rule because it aligns to the 3-day rule of GDPR. And so it's always nice from our perspective to have some guidelines and consistency. Maureen is right. The understanding of when something material has been identified is the crucial key. I think, and this is where I want to go off the rails a little bit, but for those of us that have really good programs in our company, materiality, even though we believe that the SEC has given us this definition of it, is still very squishy, and it is open to interpretation, as we all believe. But I think that when we have really good programs that as CISOs we can stand behind, the amount of disclosure that occurs, and usually, as we know from general counsel and the CEO, we should be confident that we can stand behind the disclosure and talk about all the things that went right in our program. And I feel that companies that don't have strong programs, this is where it gets just a little dicey.
I got to agree with Sue. I think what the SEC is doing here is they're kind of trying to bring everybody up to the same level. So if we think about, what Jim said, what Bob said, what Maureen said, what Sue said, these are industries that are heavily regulated. And so there are a lot of these reporting requirements today. And so if you think about those areas where they're not having that, then putting that 4 days on there, and also the 10K disclosure about how are you managing cybersecurity in your organization. These are things that maybe companies are not taking seriously today. And now the SEC is saying, hey, look, no matter what industry you're in, if you're a publicly traded company, we're going to bring you all up to the same level. That's why I think it's a really great thing. It's kind of long overdue, but I'm very happy that this happened. Maybe there's some little tweaks and changes that need to be made to it, but overall, I think it's a positive thing.
And we need to keep in mind, too, there's also a difference between disclosing that there is a material incident versus providing the details of the material incident in 4 days. You can disclose that you have an incident, and you may be reporting later on the details of it, but more than likely you won't have all those details to be able to report within those 4 days, and you have to just provide that initial notification. So the details in there can be very minimal with the disclosure that you have an incident that is materialistic. So,
are there examples in the marketplace of companies that have gotten themselves into trouble over their definition? You guys were talking about how squishy the definition of materiality could be. Are there any examples where companies have kind of gotten into trouble over that issue?
Uber.
Yeah, there's a lot of.
Go ahead, Erica.
Go ahead, Andrew. Okay, I was going to say there's probably quite a few of them, and I think part of the reason why the SEC is making this stance is because of the delay, right? We've had some companies that it's been, I mean, literally months, near a year before you finally learn about it, and from an investor's point of view, that does not seem like the right way to make that decision. And so, yeah, there's tons certainly that have delayed, and so 4 business days is going to put a little bit of fire behind making sure, like you said, you have a thorough process. You can defend your stance on how you make the decisions, and you can at least disclose, primarily, for the purposes of the investors, that there is something being worked through. And even if you don't know all the details, I think someone mentioned you don't share all of those, but as you learn more, right, you'll have the Form 8K to provide a little bit more insight into what happens as you learn more through your periodic reporting.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations that's going to happen is, to Maureen's point, is how soon do we think that is going to become material, right? With the information we know, is that currently actually material or not? And then how do we keep on tracking it so when it does become material, do we all of a sudden look like the bad guys because we didn't notify right away that it has a potential to be there, right? I think that's one of the concerns across the board.
A natural question for me would be, would companies start to just kind of like, when in doubt, report? Would they start to over-report, or report just so much so that it ends up kind of overwhelming the system, if you will?
So, Jeremy, I think that actually happened when the SEC first required reporting on the 10K. There were some companies that would report ransomware or a malware attack. At a large company, if I reported a malware attack, I'd have to do that 150 times a day, right? So, and that becomes the crux in the federal government looking at, I have to applaud SEC. They said materiality to your company. It's a business focus. It's a business view. It's tied back to your financials in the SEC. The problem we're starting to see is we're going to report all incidents to, CISA, FBI, who is it that we're going to report to, and then how are we going to do it? We've all been wrapped around with sticks and taxis, and, what are you going to do with the information once you have it? The SEC, I do applaud them. A very clear message around stockholder value, and it's around materiality, and here's a time frame, versus some of the other, hey, you report every cyber event you have, because I don't know where to go with some of that.
Yeah, I would add maybe just, so I do think there's going to result in over-reporting, right? I mean, I think it's only natural, because nobody's going to want to not disclose something, not do the right thing, I don't think. So I think this is going to put more pressure on our communications teams, right, on our legal teams, et cetera, right, to be able to retract some of those things, to say, well, yes, we know we may have prematurely notified or prematurely disclosed something. In reality, it is not material, right? So I think companies are going to have to think about what is that retraction mechanism as well, just from a brand reputation perspective, to be able to say, hey, we're doing the right thing. In the course of doing that, we had to retract something, and no, it wasn't really as big as we thought it was. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic that we're going to have to kind of monitor and see how companies react.
Matt is absolutely correct. If you have a good incident response plan that also has a communication plan in it, you can then show, step by step to, an auditor, a regulator, authorities, whoever, that you're following a plan that everyone has agreed on who should be doing the actual communication. And I do think for CISOs and the liability that's before them with this SEC regulation, that they have to rely on those communication plans, because usually it's a group of people that are getting together to define the problem. And then, if it's PR or the CEO or whoever's launching that communication outwardly, it's their responsibility, to put that in place. So I totally agree with what you were saying there.
I'm going to go back to you. Go ahead, Dee. I lost it again.
The different perspectives coming from the oil and gas, right? Like Andrew was saying that SEC has done this leveling up. This is going to take a while to normalize for everyone, to standardize what that materiality is. Because in the oil and gas, the number one material is the safety issue. Live. This is when something goes boom, that's material. Now, from the cyber perspective, we're trying to kind of, okay, at which point that would define at materiality. So from that perspective, it's still going to be taking a while to do that normalization. But I do want to pivot a little bit here. The ruling, I'm excited about it because it puts the CISOs now at a business risk level versus considered as cybersecurity as an IT issue and IT risk. So I'm very excited about that. Now, for CISOs who are on the verge of, having a mental breakdown, it may push them over the edge, but it elevates their roles. And my hope is that CISO can change the reporting in oil and gas and many industries as well, still reporting to the CIO where they still have competing priorities in terms of keeping the lights on, keeping the low budget, or keeping the cost down, and cybersecurity when it needs to happen, when you do the remediation, those two do not apply. Andrew.
Thank you, Dee. So I want to go back to a previous question from Jeremy about have there been any recent cases? And Matt was talking about kind of walking things back. There's two recent cases from the SEC where they sort of made examples of companies where they reported. So it was First American Title and Pearson View. And both of them reported incidents, but they kind of downplayed it and said like, oh, it's not a big deal. Nobody saw anything. It's not bad at all. And then after the investigation, it turned out that, in fact, they did do things and they did have problems. And in some cases, the IT team even realized how bad it was and they went and fixed it, but they didn't tell anybody to go back and report it again. So these are the kind of things that we're going to, these escalation paths that we're going to need to have in place to say, hey, we figured out that actually it's a lot worse than we thought. And so we're going to have to go report again, and we're going to have to say something else. So I think those things are going to be key as we move forward into this and we kind of understand this new, new scenario that we're living in.
Absolutely.
And I was just going to add there, Andrew, or comment on that it really shows where or the importance of your incident response plan and how that goes. And until you, the CISO closes that incident as being done, all of those things that you just talked about needs to be reported in. And then finally, that final report then can be looked at and then reported on to the appropriate, SEC or whoever it might be. But if that governance of the incident isn't taking place, then there's a problem with the incident response that's occurring, and that's a top-down issue.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would say, Mark, too. I mean, just real quick, that reminds me, we really need to think about how an organization. You know what? I just totally forgot my train of thought. How's that for life?
Well, let me transition into a question for you guys. As I understand it, a key area that was left out of the ruling is how the SEC will protect the data. So, as the premise is to ensure that the shareholders are made aware of relevant incidents, they would post all of this information publicly, I presume. Does anybody have any thoughts on that piece about how they would protect the data?
I think the bigger concerns about that were with the original proposal. So in the updated ruling, they said, it's really just the business impact of it. I still think that I do understand people's concerns about that if you're thinking about it from informing an attacker of materiality side, right? So if I'm an attacker and I've done something, now I know that this thing works. I could try it against other companies, or I could look at it as a roadmap to say, hey, this company keeps getting nailed. Maybe they're an easy target for me to go and attack. So there are some negative sides to it, but I think the overall thing is positive in terms of elevating things.
Yeah, I agree. I know when there's a big breach, my question is, how did they do it? What was the vulnerability? What sort of, I want to know those details, because then I could look into my environments and make sure that there isn't anything that was happening there. I think the overall potential good of the details is going to be better that it is publicly available. But if it's like some of the other reporting, if you go look at instant reporting, from the state of New York, where someone discusses a breach, there is no details there at all. And so if that's the level of expectation there, which is really defined in the SEC ruling from what I saw on what they're expecting the details to be in the ruling or in the announcement. So if it's very generic, very polished, then there's really not any value to them even posting in the AK that they even had a breach in the first place, in my opinion. So
absolutely.
And I think it's important to note too that the regulation does allow for some exceptions, right? Now it says pretty clearly those are going to be very limited. But in the case of a national security issue, a public safety issue, a customer proprietary information concern, it sounds like they're going to be reasonable with some of that. So I'm with you, Mark. I think the level of detail will be interesting to kind of see what plays out. But at least the SEC is kind of recognizing that, hey, we're not expecting national security things to be exposed here necessarily.
Yeah, great.
Well, even on that reporting piece, as Andrew said, I think the initial round of this was much more prescriptive as to here's what's going to be in it, and it's got to be about the actual attack itself. And I think the piece that actually got through is much more about the business impact, right? Which from a stockholder perspective, I think is appropriate, right? Is it embarrassing? Sure. But that's part of what will get the business side of this to actually move. From Mark's piece of it, is it going to help us on the intel perspective? I don't see that one happening. Right?
Yeah. Bob, you bring up a very good point here is that, what's going to start happening is you're going to have a report for the SEC that looks like this, and you're going to have to have one for Health and Human Services that looks like this, and one for FDA that looks like this, or you name the other agencies. And I think that's part of the, one of the things that we try to do, or my team did, is we escalated the reporting outside of the security organization. And that's almost like, to a CISO is don't you be the person doing the reporting. Make sure it's the privacy office or compliance or your legal, that there is a designated individual or group of people that are doing that, because your primary job is going to be investigating to make sure what is the extent of what has occurred, and then working with the IT teams for recovery. And those CISOs that have become that, end all be all for their company for anything that's cyber, to include breach and reporting, should probably see how they can get more team members in their company involved in the process.
Yeah, rather than all in one person, Yeah.
Oh yeah. When I hear CISOs talking about what's materiality, I just want to say, why don't you go talk to your CFO, give them that task, and they'll tell you. Because when you determine it, then you own it. But if they own it and have come up with materiality, it helps protect you. You're investigating to help determine from a cyber perspective.
Sounds like good career advice to any CISO listening right now. Let me kind of talk a little bit also about just in general, because this to me it would seem like something that would be discussed. A lot of what we've been talking about right now are probably board level discussions happening right now, this very year and this very quarter. It, I think, how does cyber insurance, because most companies are covered, right, with cybersecurity insurance, and if they are, and if they feel like any incident is fully covered, does that make it where it's no longer considered materiality? Like, how does cyber insurance come into play? Let me throw this one over to Andrew.
Oh, it's to me? Okay. Well, I'm going to follow Maureen's advice, and I'm going to give that to my CFO. So, hey, CFO, you decide if this thing is covered by insurance. Is it still material? I think it depends on the company. I think it depends on the incident. I think it depends on your insurance. I think those are all things. Maybe Erica, she works for an insurance company. She can give us a better answer on this one than I can.
Erica, have any thoughts?
Well, I'm in reinsurance, but I will say I do think there's a lot of it depends, like you said, because even with the cyber insurance component coverage, usually there's limits on that. So having to still pay, right, even though insurance covers it, that might still impact bottom line. So I think there's just different perspectives that'll have to be considered. But it should certainly be a cross-functional team led by, compliance, legal, echoing what has been said already, CFO, to kind of drive what that means for the organization.
Hey, Jeremy,
Yeah.
I'll share with you perspective. I don't think insurance enters in the equation for determining materiality. Insurance covers resources, incident response resources, temporary resources, consulting resources, et cetera, for incident response. And to some degree, they cover minimal aspects of liability. And I say minimal because it's really small. And liability is the biggest one. So the reality is, I don't think this should enter into the equation. We got 4 days to determine materiality of a breach. We don't even know the coverage, what's going to be covered by the insurance companies other than resources or temporary resources. And even if you had coverage for temporary resources, that you could still have materiality in terms of shareholder impact. So my recommendation would be it doesn't enter into the equation because the timing doesn't jive with 4 days. And it's not necessarily a factor in the consideration of materiality. That's my view.
I agree with Jim. I've known some companies who chose not to have cybersecurity insurance. They are self-insured, and right. So when it comes to the materiality, the insurance should cover. It's mostly for compliance. When your third party, your supplier, your JV is asking, "Do you have cybersecurity insurance?" That's usually, in my experience, why companies buy cyber insurance policy.
Okay.
And
Bob,
I think across the board, kind of like Maureen said, we're getting into a spot where all of a sudden the matrix of questions that we have to answer is becoming greater and greater, right? Because if you look at materiality from an impact to the business perspective, there are events that are bad that might actually cost us money, but don't impact our ability to make money in the future, right? So if you think about for manufacturing, obviously ransomware piece that impacts operations, oh, that's huge. That's actually very impactful. Loss of data, if it's intellectual property, maybe not so much, right? So now all of a sudden we have these multiple layers of questioning, okay, is this a privacy issue that we might have a risk of a sanction? Is this a impact to the business futures in loss of intellectual property? Is this a loss of business capability now, which is a temporary piece, which is operations, right? And unfortunately, each one of those has a different chain that's going to be, that means we need to notify these folks because that's a different level of materiality and a different time frame, et cetera, et cetera. And to Jim's point a little bit, I think the 4 days starts when you define and determine materiality, right? Which is different from from many of our other pieces. That if you are regulated to some degree, it might be from the actual point of determining an impact or determining the actual infection, things like that. So again, it's just becoming a more complex environment for us to walk through. And I don't think any one group could or should do that on their own.
Gotcha.
Well,
Let
and Bob,
me.
you bring up a really good point. Is that we're obsessing on cyber events and cyber insurance, but the reality is, our IT departments have probably caused more outage and more material events that we've all lived through than the cyber stuff that we're managing and handling. And so, I realize this obsession on the cyber world, but I mean, we can name banks that were out for weeks because, their IT went bad, or you can't do things, and nothing is ever said about those. So I really think that let's look at cyber first, and then it's also going to get into the resiliency. That's going to show real quick in there, because not all material events are because of cyber.
Very good point. Very good point. Does anyone else have anything else to chime in on this? I have another interesting topic I think we want to wrap up with today. Anybody else have anything to chime in on?
No,
I'm just hoping you're going to talk about D&O insurance and legislation on removing liability if the CISO reports, like the HIPAA and some of the other rules have.
So, Jeremy, I think it's been said, in a roundabout way here, but I just want to be very explicit for the audience, right? I think we've talked about incidents evolve, right? And I think that is the biggest challenge that I have, as I'm looking at incidents and I'm dealing with situations, is what I know today might change in an hour, in a minute, in 3 days, in 30 days, right? And it's just the reality of how these investigations occur and how the forensics occurs and those kinds of things. And so I think, it's important to remind the audience, especially that aren't in security, that these things do evolve, and it's just a nature of the beast, right? We're trying to decipher what happened, understand and discover what happened. And so there's just a lot of variables that have to be gone through. And I think that's just important for people to remember, and why we're talking about all these complexities and all these potential challenges.
I think if you just to take off what Matt was saying, at this juncture, if anyone doesn't believe that their company can't be attacked, I think they're being foolish. And, even when something bad has happened, and it does, I firmly believe that the ability to disclose as quickly as possible, not with all the details, because the SEC is not saying that they need them, but to disclose as quickly as possible and to try to put an event that has occurred in the right light, so that your company comes out of it looking like people look at you from a trust standpoint, because that's what you're trying to do here, is regain your brand trust. And the more secretive you get, and the more that you don't communicate about what has happened, you have to, it begs to have people start saying and asking the question, what are they doing there? What's happened to my data? What's happening to how they're processing information? So I like to think that this SEC ruling is going to help, even though the CISO still has a lot of liability, which I agree should go away.
Absolutely. Well, guys, let's shift a little bit to just the broader question of why should public boards have a CISO sitting on the board? Obviously, CISOs report to boards, quarterly, and they go in and they get in front of them. Why is it a good idea for an actual CISO to sit on the board? Do you guys have any major thoughts around this ever important issue?
I'll start.
I'm sure everybody has major thoughts around this issue,
Exactly.
Jeremy. I'm just gonna kick us off and say, I'm gonna echo something that Maureen said earlier, which is the SEC has been requiring public companies to report on material risk forever. So that's nothing new, right? And cybersecurity is a material risk. Go look at the ERM of any big company. Cybersecurity is going to be in the top 3, top 5 risks. So people should already be doing it. Companies should already be doing it. I think what the SEC is saying is, hey, this is important. Don't forget about this. Make sure that you start doing this. And the requirements are about, how you're managing cybersecurity. That's going to go in your 10K. What is the process that you're doing? And as I said before, it's going to elevate those companies. Sue keeps saying, if you're doing a good job of this already, it's not a big deal, right? Because you're just going to show, here's the great stuff I'm already doing. If you're not doing this, if you're not taking this seriously today, you're going to have to now. I think that's really what's happening.
I would say too that those of us on this call that are providing executive advice to boards as well as teaching them will tell you that a lot of board members just don't understand cybersecurity at the lowest level versus the highest level. They just don't have that kind of background. So it's important to have somebody who can talk to the board about what's actually happening in their companies.
And a 2-day class is not going to get them the expertise. You know, I couldn't take a 2-day class and become the CFO. So, you know, there's, I've been seeing that being put out there. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's so that the board can ask the right questions when they have the cybersecurity expertise. Because many times, you know, even us CISOs preparing for the board reports, you take 2-3 months to prepare it for every quarter. You get the 5-minute slot, no question asked. And, you know, sometimes we try to go through the audit committee, the internal audit report saying, hey, this is a hint. This is what the board should be asking. But they didn't ask because they don't understand where to begin, like Sue said, even at the lowest level.
They don't even know the questions to ask. You know, they don't know what they don't know. Right, correct.
Yeah,
Dee Dee, I love you said that, because, you know, one of the things that I think about is in the importance of having somebody, you know, security aware on the board is, I honestly want to be held accountable, right? Hold me accountable, right? Advise me. That's what you're there for, right? Tell me what we should be thinking about, right? And help me think through some of those things. And have some of that interaction. I know we're supposed to have those answers, and we typically do, right? But it's always good to have that advice and counsel available.
Yeah, I think
one of the areas that having a CISO or CISO expertise at the board level, and it also could be a cybersecurity or a technology committee that reports into the board, depending upon the size of the company, because some companies it's a rather large leap. But it's interesting on the companies that I'm associated with, the questions that I can ask as a CISO, where I get the dashboards, this is good, this is good, this is good. But then I can ask the question, do you have any Windows 2003 in your environment? And I said, and when I get the answer, it's now pivoting to the CIO, right? And the questions around the CIO. To understand, and people then, well, I was like, well, their patching metrics are going to be good. It's going to be 100%, but you can't patch this. We now need to change the metrics to anything that can't be patched needs to be not patched as a metric. And it's just some of those subtle things that start bringing awareness that I think that the CISO on the board, and certainly Jim has probably much more expertise in this, and let's get Jim's opinion on this. But I do see that understanding the business of security, the funding of it, and is the security budget under the CIO, or is there a separate? How do you measure? What are the third-party assessments you've had? Just some of those we consider somewhat easy questions, we can ask those questions. And that brings to light some very important factors that may be hidden under the stack.
Yeah, I'd like to see regulation that specifies every single public board should have a CISO that wears a light blue T-shirt on Thursdays.
Love that.
Oh, wait a minute. Is that too self-serving? Oh, darn. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
No, but I
think
think that's the key, though. Is at the end of the day, yeah, I think we have a problem of the amount of security professionals out there that can actually operate at the executive board level, right? I think that's just a maturity piece for our industry. And you know, if my board is listening here, you know, I vote for Maureen on my board. You know, but you know, hopefully we'll start to see as some of the CISOs, you know, are rolling off. Some of us longtime CISOs that have been out there, you know, giving back to that industry, giving back to the companies that we're doing. You know, that's one of those big pieces that we need to start thinking about and educating our CISOs on more, you know, executive level function, on more business level function, so we can actually get there, right? Because right. To Jim's point, it's going to be, you know, us on this call, you know, trying to fill 14,000 positions.
That's right. That's right. And look, guys, this is a great place, I think, to stop for today, because this is such an important topic. We could go for hours. And we hope that everyone watching and listening continues to chime in on this topic, ask questions below. You know, the folks on this call are going to be hashtagged on LinkedIn on this session. And let's keep the conversation going. We also are going to have an upcoming podcast with Tammy Moskaitis of Psi Alliance and formerly a CISO of Home Depot and Time Warner Cable. We're going to talk about the career side of CISO and how do you go after board positions. And we're going to do a whole nother topic that I think would kind of parallel what we were starting to get into even here. So we hope that you guys continue to just stay tuned to, you know, future informational podcasts that'll be coming out for this group. And, you know, I want to thank all of you guys for all of the great content today and everything you brought to this discussion. And maybe we can down the road do a part 2, you know, not too soon, but down the road, and, you know, just keep the discussion going. Okay, so thank you guys all so much today for joining me, and look forward to keeping the conversation going in the threads below on these podcasts.